Hello, everyone. I trust you've had a good lunch. Welcome to the afternoon session. My name is Alan Cheboy, Senior Investigations Manager at Code for Africa, and I'm going to be the moderator for this particular session. So the session itself is more or less a follow-up on the session that we had in the morning. In the morning, we did discuss a high-level approach to mis and disinformation on the continent, including domestic and foreign influence operations. So on this session, we are going to focus on domestic influence operations and disinformation campaigns. And majority of these conversations on this particular panel, you'll see, will focus on the techniques and the tools and the methodologies of how to do such kind of an investigation. So I hope that you have your notes ready. I know it's going to be a really interesting conversation. We're going to have about 20 minutes presentation from Jean and 20 minutes presentation from Odanga. And I know they'll introduce themselves more extensively, but just to give a high-level introduction, Odanga Madung is the co-founder. Odanga Madung, apologies, is the co-founder of Odipo and also a Mozillo fellow. Jean Githae is part of the iLab team, which is within Code for Africa, that looks at mis and disinformation campaigns on the African continent. And yeah, welcome everyone. Over to you, Jean.
Great, thanks Alan, and a huge hello to everybody who's listening in from all across the continent. My name is Jean Githae. I am a senior investigative data analyst here at Code for Africa's iLab team, and I'm very happy to be part of this session where we'll be talking more about some of the techniques that we see or that we have seen in the past year and a half or so that we've been doing these kinds of open source investigations into mis and disinformation in East Africa. I can hand over to Odanga for an introduction as well.
Thank you. So my name is Odanga Madung. I am the co-founder of Odipo Dev and also a fellow at the Mozillo Foundation, where my work is to research the unpredictable impact that the internet is having on African societies. And so what I hope to bring to this conversation is, that aspect of tech and society, right? That tech doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so can we center a lot of the work that we're doing around, real world harm, and hopefully, eventually, shine a light on the kind of neglect that platforms are doing and the kind of effects that that is having across the continent. So, thank you.
Yeah, just to mention that in case you have any questions, feel free to note it down, and we'll be able to highlight or have a conversation around them in the last 20 minutes of this particular session. Yeah, so back to you, Jean. I know you have a very lengthy presentation.
All right.
Welcome.
Yes, let's get started on that. Okay, so we're going to be sharing some of the techniques that we've observed in mis and disinformation campaigns, specifically targeting Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia. We've been doing this work for the past year and a half, and the techniques that we see, each country does have its own distinct way that the campaigns play out, but that doesn't mean that they're specifically unique to that country. We see techniques jumping over from one country to the next, and which is why it's a good idea just to share what those are. So I'll start by introducing the iLab team that I am a part of. Can move on to the next slide. Yes, so the iLab team, part of Code for Africa, we spearhead investigations into forensic analysis of digital disinformation campaigns, influence operations, and toxic content on our social media spaces that is aimed at misleading citizens and polarizing the public using hate speech, radicalization, and other techniques within the African continent. So that's me. I'm a senior investigative analyst. So let's just chat a bit about how it is that these disinformation actors do their do their activities. You can move on to the next slide. So the way these campaigns, these disinformation campaigns are packaged, and I know in the morning we spoke a lot about how this happened in the Ugandan elections and in other electoral spaces. And what we see is that the campaigns even though they are different in different countries, they all follow these same 6 steps that are carefully crafted to their specific audience. So the first thing that they do, whoever is behind these campaigns, they'll identify who exactly it is that they want to target. Do they want to target a certain age demographic? Do they want to target a certain voter demographic? They'll identify that and create a narrative that is very suitable to their audience. So if, let's say, they are targeting an older demographic, maybe they'll choose to do it offline, even like radio advertisements or something. If they're targeting a younger demographic, they'll pick, the methodologies that are applicable to them, maybe memes or manipulated images. Then they'll package that narrative, that story, whatever they want, into a very well-crafted campaign. They could even time to release it at a very sensitive, volatile point in time. So maybe it's an election word, maybe a few days or weeks to the election. If it is a campaign that's targeting a certain court ruling, maybe a day or two after that court ruling. And then they will identify or create a suitable network of accounts and profiles on social media that they use to accelerate their narrative. It could be on Facebook, it could be on Twitter. On Twitter, they have the leeway to even use automated accounts, bot accounts, that are much easier to manipulate. They could also pay a network of accounts, and I'm sure Odanga will be able to speak to that some more. Then they will have some accounts whose work will be to post the original content, and the ones whose work will be to retweet and amplify so that the narrative gets more traction on Twitter. Then the trend can also be picked up by legitimate influencers or people who may not necessarily know that this is a campaign. And then now that becomes tricky when now people will take the words of the legitimate influencers as the truth, and then they get convinced that this disinformation campaign is actually something legitimate. Can move on to the next slide, please. So in Kenya, we have seen this play out in many different ways, and one of the most popular ways that we've seen, they will manipulate newspaper covers, and they will also use very many coordinated hashtags. So the first investigation that we did that was a really interesting kind of investigation, a rather large one. We, in June 2020, identified a coordinated network of troll accounts that were working on both Twitter and Facebook to spread disinformation against Kenya's Deputy President William Ruto. Then they were aiming at discrediting his political interest in the 2022 elections. And we found a total of 7,488 accounts, and they generated a total of 16,000 mentions. And this was in the span of maybe a week or so. So every day we woke up and we found a new hashtag against the deputy president. And how they were doing this, they were essentially acting in an inauthentic way so that it looked like the hashtags were more popular than they were, so that they could influence and manipulate the algorithm on Twitter so that their hashtags could come up at the top. So let's see how some of the different techniques that they used for this. So one thing that we've noted and we continue to note about how the coordinated hashtags happen in Kenya, they almost always promptly start at 6 a.m. because there are very few people online at 6 a.m. They want their hashtag to have gained momentum by the time people are coming online, maybe like 7 or 8. So it will start, it will hit its peak point maybe 11 a.m. and then it goes down like that for the course of the day. We also note that there's a very interesting phenomenon that we like to call ambulance chasers. So people who are not necessarily disinformation actors, they'll just jump onto the hashtag because they'll take advantage of its popularity. They'll maybe be selling clothes or laptops or something, and then this further contributes to those hashtags getting more and more popular over the course of the day. So around like 11 a.m. they die off, and then the next day you'll see another one. So in the course of this week, the first hashtag that we saw was something about Ruto ghost numbers. A few days later, we see another one that Ruto wanted to kill Uhuru. A few days later, yet another one that Ruto was a wife beater. Again, Ruto must go. And then the last one that we saw was how Ruto betrayed Uhuru. In the span of a week, the same accounts pushing the same narratives, more or less. They're just changing the hashtag from one to the other, and they're all doing this at the same time, each and every day. And one of the techniques that they were using was manipulated front pages. And how we were able to actually see this was through the help of PesaCheck. They kept on debunking these fake pages over the course of the week, which is also what helped us find this. So the image we have on the left is one of the posts that was shared. They're just like his corrupt counterpart, Waititu. The state has frozen the Kenyan chief priest of corruption's accounts, how Ruto betrayed Uhuru. And it shared an image that was allegedly the front page of the Daily Nation of that day that they had shared it. But actually, that was not the front page. What the Daily Nation was discussing then was that for Uhuru, a season of tough decisions. Now, the first time you see this image, you may not know that this has been manipulated, because it looks very convincing. Everything else is the same. Whatever was on the side is the same. The only thing that they've changed is the main one. And not everybody will necessarily see it and be able to check that this is actually a manipulated image. So again, we know how there's a lot of crossover between Facebook and Twitter. So imagine someone seeing this on Twitter, sharing it on a Facebook group, and then now so many people on the other side are believing that, oh, indeed, the state has President Ruto's account. And some of the things that were being discussed in the morning is how these things that we are seeing online, these manipulated images, they can trigger people to committing some more heinous acts offline. So this was an example under that. Yet another manipulated image. Now this one, we saw it under the Ruto, the wife beater. The manipulated headline of that day was that Rachel Ruto, who is the deputy president's wife, was in hiding. But indeed that day the headline was that Raila's snow to nusu mkate. And when you look at it, the only thing that they've changed is that main part, and it's still very easy to believe that this has been, that this is the real thing. And this whole manipulation is not just unique to our traditional news sites, to our newspapers. This can also happen to online news sites. Again, part of this campaign, they really used, manipulating the media as their main way to do it. So this tweet shared an article that was a screen grab that was allegedly from Africa Confidential, saying that they had published an article on an assassination attempt against the president. So if you see that screenshot and maybe you're not so familiar with the layout of the Africa Confidential website, you'll think that it's something real, but Africa Confidential published a statement that they had not published this article, that this was all manipulated. So this is not just unique to traditional print media. Yet another interesting technique that we see in Kenya is this poll-based amplification of sorts that helps again to manipulate the algorithm. So here we are dealing with the ambulance chasers who are just jumping onto the trend, and then we're also dealing with this poll-based amplification. So what they'll do, they'll say, it's a very simple question, who do you think should succeed Uhuru in 2022? Like for Raila, retweet for Ruto. It's very easy, and this one will also incorporate people who are not necessarily part of the campaign. Then they'll just see it. Oh, it's just an interesting tweet. I like Raila or I like Ruto, and then they'll click on whichever suits them. And then now again, these kinds of tweets will contribute to all these being pushed higher onto the trending topics, and again, the campaign kind of gaining that quote-unquote legitimate traction. So those are the different techniques we've seen in Kenya. And again, these are not specifically unique. They can also be played out in another country, and let's see how this happened in Uganda in December 2020. So theirs was a bit different in that it actually involved some actors from the government itself. And there's an investigation that was done by DFR Labs, and we also did a similar one. into a pro-government network that was engaging in suspicious online activity ahead of the elections. And again, as was discussed in the morning, they mentioned how they noted all these hashtags that were coming up every time Bobby Wine got arrested. You'd see one kind of hashtag or the other that was being used to amplify the false content. So one of the hashtags that was being used was Stop Hooliganism. Another one was National Useless Platform. And these were being used to paint a picture of a very destructive NUP. So while there were protests following his arrest, and what the people who are behind this campaign were doing, they were taking advantage of the protests to amplify this disinformation and misinformation using old images from past protests. So for example, here is an image, here's a tweet from November 2020. It says, below is a picture where hooligans are destroying a road with billions of taxpayers' money, and why does Bobby Wine and his NUP like trading in violence? Stop hooliganism. And then there's a photo of the burning road. But actually, this was a photo from very many years back that was being repurposed into this campaign. And again, what we were saying, this online acts, they may look small, but they can trigger somebody to do something very, very bad offline. Again, now there were protests that were ongoing. Now imagine people seeing this and getting triggered to commit more heinous acts offline. Yet more examples here. So another tweet with 3 images that were allegedly from destruction that had been occasioned by the NUP. And these images, one was from a riot in Uganda in 2011, and another one was from Kenya in 2017. And in the dossier, we found many more examples of such repurposing of images. There was one that was repurposed, yet another one repurposed from Kenya. And you see, again, when someone just sees this online for the first time, they will not always think, maybe I should fact check this. They'll just see it and they'll take it as the truth, then again, could trigger them into some more heinous acts. So as we know, Facebook did take down these, the ones that were on Facebook, they were taken down by Facebook, and we know how that ended up for Uganda, in that the platform ended up being banned for some time. And yeah, the network was actually found to be linked to the Government Citizens Interaction Center and the Ministry of ICT in Uganda. So this, again, our region is very diverse in the kinds of things that we see. So I'll now share a bit about what we've seen in Ethiopia and how the diaspora does play its part. But this one is a bit different. Let me just start by saying that this case that I'm going to talk about here, Ethiopia's hashtag activism, actually originated as some efforts to raise awareness about what was happening to the Oromo community in Ethiopia. But it ended up turning into an avenue for the circulation of mis and disinformation against the community. So there were protests following the murder, the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa's and prominent musician in the country. And what happened, that's when now this hashtag called Oromo Protests, which has been used numerous times over the years, was used to draw attention to these and to other activities that were happening in the country at the time. So one technique that was used, especially by the diaspora community, was this pre-drafted tweets. So there was a website that they had set up, Justice for Hachalu. So they had pre-drafted these tweets. All you needed to do was go to that website and click on the tweet, and then you'll now have it on your own feed, and they were like categorized into different themes, that we demand resignation, we demand peace and justice and facts for the death of Hachalu. So this technique, while it was being used in that context, remember it can also be used to amplify disinformation. A very easy way, you just get people to go to the website, click, and they amplify. Now, in the midst of all of this, we did note that this disinformation was happening and people were repurposing old images to try and push a false narrative. So like this one, they said that this was an image from Oromia, but it was actually not. It was from a totally different event, and we found this through a reverse image search. It was actually a screen grab from a video that was taken at another point in time. And another image that we found that was saying that this again is in the Oromia region, that this Arabic act should be called genocide. As long as Ahmed is in power, then this is enough to show that Amhara will end up being killed. Then an image of some people on the ground, and we actually did a reverse image search and found that that was from the Rwanda genocide in 1994. So this is how disinformation actors, they will try to pick that thing that they know people will feel most emotive, that be emotionally moved or triggered by it, and use that and play it out in all these different ways. So those were my 20 minutes. Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I'm hoping that, I know in the previous session we had a number of questions specifically on how the Uganda election, how we identified the trends and how Facebook picked up the misinformation and disinformation that was being shared during the elections or before the elections. So I hope that it's kind of cleared a number of your questions. Yeah, let's now hear from Odanga. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. So I'm waiting for my slides.
As the tech team is preparing for that, I don't know if we have any burning questions from that presentation, either from the audience or even from people who are joining us online. Yeah, we have a question from Declan.
So I thought your, do I need a microphone or can I just talk? So I thought very interesting presentation, especially on Kenya, and the observation that you found that disinformation was beginning at 6 o'clock. That was not actually a nuance that I picked up on. So of those incidents and examples that you provided, how long did that, I'll call it a campaign for lack of a better term, how long did that campaign go for? Mm-hmm. And then do you have any insight as to, okay, we could probably infer what the intent is, but what was the strategic thinking that you were able to infer based off of that campaign?
Okay, so the whole the 6 a.m. thing, it's something we continue to see. They will, again, there are fewer people online at 6, so they'll try and play that the algorithm, it will pick up earlier. It will run the legitimate part, or the ones who are really the ones behind it. They'll run maybe 3 hours. After that, they will let the rest of the ambulance chasers and everybody selling things do their work for them. In terms of the strategic thinking, I think what we see is they mostly try to play to something that's relevant at that point in time. So if it's like something to do with the BBI, after the BBI ruling, they'll try to play something that's relevant at that specific point in time, something maybe of national interest at that point. Yeah.
Okay, so for the length of time, so was it just a week, or did it continue on? Is it still happening every week? Like what was the observation in terms of?
So for that specific one, we saw it over a week. Then in the months that followed, you'd see an occasional hashtag here and then. We again continue to see them based on what is trending at that specific moment. I don't know if Alan or Nanga, you may have anything to add.
Yeah, probably just to also add on that, since I was also part of the investigation team, what we decided once we picked up on that particular kind of trend, so where they are using politicians' name to create hashtags and then use those hashtags to actually amplify disinformation to the Kenyan public. And they did actually the 6 a.m. Start of the hashtags or the trend is very strategic in itself, because that means not many people are online at that time, as Jean said. So you are able to kind of trigger the Twitter algorithm to start identifying that as a specific trend as early as possible. So that once people, and what we've seen with the ambulance chasers, it almost occupies almost 30% of the tweet network, or the data using the users using those hashtags. So what happens is people now come online at about 7 a.m., 8 a.m., and they want to sell their products. And what we've seen happening, especially on Twitter's space, is that they now use these hashtags that are already trending. And in that way, if you are a disinformation actor, you know that my hashtag, or the one that I've created, will actually get picked up by these ambulance chasers. And at the end of the day, it will actually amplify itself. So we saw that those actors don't necessarily participate in the trend till the evening. Yeah? As you've seen, the cycle ends in a day. They only fuel it, and then they let it now proceed going organically through ambulance chasers, through the other techniques. So I think that in itself is very strategic. Yeah. So I think we can go back to Odanga. Over to you.
Thank you, Alan. My name is Odanga Madung, as I had mentioned before. And what I will be talking about, so maybe a bit about myself, is that I'm the co-founder of a media innovation and data consultancy called Odipo, which is based in 3 countries, three countries within East Africa, which is Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. And I'm also a fellow at the Mozillo Foundation and a data journalist. And you can find some of my work, or I've worked with BuzzFeed News, and I'm currently under contract with Wired magazine. And so I came to this idea around writing about the disinformation for hire industry in Kenya, because I think about it more as an industry. And so when I investigate what happens within the disinformation landscape in East Africa, I look at how money changes hands, who provides the demand, who provides the supply, and who facilitates that entire transaction to happen. And so when we started, I think you can move on to the next slide. So when we started, my colleague and I, Brian Obillo, started looking into this. We had just joined Mozilla. And how our fellowship sort of works is that we are attached to civil society organizations in order to be able to sort of help them navigate, or rather help them navigate their work and enhance their impact by showing them what the impact technology is having on society could be. So in the process of having those conversations with many of these civil society organizations, we constantly found one very interesting thing. Perhaps many of you in the audience may have heard of this idea that, people within NGOs are funded by certain foreign actors in order to disrupt our democracy, or people in NGOs are very rich and drive big cars, right? In essence, what they were telling us was that 90% of the time when an NGO is especially doing work in democracy and governance, that they would not only have to have a challenge in executing their own programs, but then there was an added challenge, which was that they had to convince the populations that they were working with that it is safe to work with us, right? And when you are investigating disinformation, we decided to look at this from a very systemic and historic perspective, because what we were trying to understand is what is the effect all of this stuff is having on our society in general. So we wanted to investigate that and find out what the historical context of that was going to be. And so looking backwards and trying to understand that Kenyan civil society has actually experienced an extensive disinformation campaign ever since the current regime came into power in 2013. We looked at that lens and began now observing what exactly was going on. And when the BBI campaigns came about, that is when we saw that we had the perfect ingredients or recipe to bring the entire ecosystem together and identify a very real-world context in which harm was being caused. And so what we did was during the BBI campaigns, in the 2 months, or rather we did our study on this specific aspect at the heat and at the height of the BBI campaigns, and especially leading up to, towards, and after the initial court ruling that had happened on May 14th, right? So our studies took about 2 months to carry out. And I think we had identified about, are the numbers here? No. We had identified a network of about 23,000 tweets, I think coming from about 3,900 to 4,000 accounts, right? But that was not only enough for us, because we wanted to investigate a system, because we didn't want it to just stop at the platform alone. We had various other questions, because when we would talk to civil society members about what was going on, especially during BBI campaigns, they mentioned that, look, every time I tweet something about BBI, I just have a whole bunch of people coming and sitting in my mentions, right? And the first few are incredibly, they're incredibly toxic, and even my own followers can't engage. So in fact, I've even left the platform, right? Number one. Number two, you notice that every single day there's a hashtag attacking the judiciary. Why are they attacking the judiciary? And then number three, of course, we've got the hashtags that, Jean has mentioned, right? Going on every single day. So our question was, why is Twitter publishing? Because the truth is, when an algorithm goes ahead and publishes these things on its trending section, right, that means Twitter is liable. Twitter is publishing that information. And so we looked at it from a point of journalism and looking at it and saying, look, at the end of the day, our job as journalists is still to hold power to account. And we needed to really think through what exactly was going on here. So we essentially went and looked at it from an entire ecosystem approach, as well as using, of course, a lot of open source technology, open source intelligence tools, which I think Jean has touched on quite a bit, right? And, the key thing that I discovered while covering, or rather have discovered while covering disinformation, is that this is an industry. And, this is an industry with facilitators, a market which has demand, supply, money changes hands, and that is, in essence, the way I look at how to investigate, disinformation networks. Just basically identifying the real people who are affected by them, the real people who participate in this industry, and those are the kind of things that we've been hunting for. So, when you look at this story now, when we look at now the kind of key issues that we identified, some of these things are things that we can't necessarily find, because I look at it more like a criminal services industry, because there are some things AI can't identify. We do tend to praise machine learning and AI quite a bit, but the truth is, I don't think an artificial intelligence algorithm is going to tell me whether someone is renting out their verified account or not, right? It's not really going to tell me what the main goal of a disinformation campaign really is, right? Because we did come to an understanding that the main goal for these guys is to poison the well, right? The main goal is to poison the well so that it's just bad for everybody, and nobody can actually be able to believe what is real and what is fake. Nobody will be able to tell from that anymore. A good example is the video that was doing the rounds about Senator Irungu Kangata of, I think, just about 2 weeks ago. That video actually came from the same network that was actually pushing out the BBI accounts. But what was interesting is that, again, from what I was able to gather is that the campaign was successful in that they got traditional media and legacy media to actually go ahead and republish that information, right? And so you begin to understand who the targets of these kind of campaigns are, right? What are the kind of methods they use to achieve those targets? And, you really get a sense of the kind of organization and, sort of nuance that goes into coming up with these campaigns, especially when you just hear about it from people. And so I think at a platform level, we had, of course, the trending algorithm is a big thing. Twitter seems to be very easy to game, but for some reason they don't seem to care whether it's very easy to game. So there's a lot of investigation that needs to be done even on Twitter itself as to why they will consistently allow the algorithms to publish such kind of information. And then you've got, of course, also big brand safety issues because out of, on top, Twitter makes money off of disinformation campaigns, right? And so there's a lot of big questions also for the brands that end up being shown alongside all of this hate speech and disinformation content as to whether they are okay with their content being seen across radicalized content. And then I think the third thing is, sorry, could you make my slides bigger? Sorry. Yeah, then of course we've got a huge lack of policy enforcement issue again as well, which is, consistently showing that, look, these guys need to be called out. Because the truth is they're not consistently enforcing their terms of policy, their terms of enforcement, their terms of service within the continent. So there's a big, big problem around there. So on my end, I look at it from the perspective of we need to investigate this entire ecosystem. And that is sort of the approach. Now, when we spoke to Twitter about this, because we felt that Twitter needs to be brought to the table on this, they said, okay, look, we've gone ahead and suspended some of our accounts. But look, that's not enough. That's not enough. You guys are creating a system that enables this kind of exchange to happen, but for some reason, and you make money off of it, but for some reason you're not willing to get rid of that, yet you've paused other features before, right? Twitter has made several mistakes in terms of the kind of, how would I call it? In terms of the mistake, they've made several mistakes with some features, especially with the verification program that they have, where they've verified parody accounts before, right? And we have a case whereby now it's very clear that verified accounts are being used for disinformation campaigns, right? They're being rented out at a cost. We've shown you the evidence, right? We've shown you transactions, but you won't take action. Why, right? So, the truth is there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of calling out these platforms, because the truth is removing accounts does not get rid of the problem. It's simply putting lipstick on a pig. And then they've told us that the investigations are still ongoing. And there is also the aspect for which I think is also a very interesting perspective on how information operations are carried out, which is that many of them have said that, look, we cannot completely be transparent with you, because if we are transparent with you, the bad actors are going to learn how exactly to game our systems, and then they will adapt. There are some corners that say that's not enough. I still really have my jury out on that one. So maybe you can go to the next slide, please. So I think maybe just as I round up, for me, maybe just a few tips on, covering disinformation campaigns, which is, I think, constantly monitor key participants, funders, entities, and networks, just so that you can, and I think Jean and you are also currently doing that, and I think that's probably a very good thing to do. Utilize tools that are often built for security researchers, marketers, and others to track the flow of information and social interactions. So for us, for example, we use a tool called Sprinkler, which is not necessarily used for, it's a paid tool, which is not necessarily used for, what is it called? By normal academic researchers, but it's used a lot by marketers in order to evaluate how their campaigns are doing. By the way, disinformation operators often send back reports showing the effectiveness of their campaigns to their clients, right? They use the same tools. So in terms of understanding the length of the information operation, it's very important to consider that as well. And then these tools, however, are not a substitute for journalism. You must develop sources, gather information, check facts, and relate things to the real world. Collaborate whenever possible with other professionals. So for example, myself, right? I'm a data journalist, I'm a researcher, but my co-author, Brian Obillo, is a super cybersecurity engineer, right? So he understood a lot of the real technical nuances that really mattered to our investigation. And so those kind of collaborations are very important. I have a friend who once told me that he just goes about to cybersecurity conferences to just talk to guys and try and find out what's going on. You know, those are now the kind of things that we really need to think about. And expose the origins, actors, and tactics to build resilience amongst your audience, because the more we talk about these things, the more audiences become savvy about what is going on within these ecosystems. And then, of course, remember that media are a target of these campaigns. When we write about these things, in some effect, we're also amplifying some of this work. And so we must be very careful to not bring more attention to this kind of work, because these people don't deserve it, right? They don't. And so that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Odanga. That was very swift and very informative. I know we have an information overload at some point, but yeah. So as people prepare to kind of share some of the questions that they might have, one question that I want to ask, and probably I'll start with Jean. We've seen that there are different tactics being used to manipulate conversations. And I've seen that, of course, the investigation that you've done highlighted a couple of them, manipulated images, we've had gaming Twitter trends. What are you seeing now that are probably newer or something that you've not highlighted in your presentation?
Now in the Kenyan space, and again, something that Perry's talked about in the morning is how vernacular languages can be used, in the sense that, because not everybody in Kenya will speak all the 42 plus languages, it's very easy now to spread your polarizing content that way. So let's say you'll take a video of someone speaking in one language and then subtitle or caption it with something totally off, something totally polarizing, and then now that starts getting circulated offline. Again, sometimes I think we underestimate the impact that our vernacular radio stations and platforms have on our society. Now imagine that polarizing content being circulated that way. That is a technique that I think we also need to keep watch for in the next year.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean. I don't know if you have any insights on that. I know you've mentioned on some of the recommendations, especially to platforms like Twitter. You've mentioned about policy. But now, when doing the investigation itself, what are some of the techniques that you really want to highlight that these disinformation actors used?
I think for me, from what I've seen is, nowadays, I think the biggest issue is the weaponization of media, right? So sort of creating a form of malinformation, because these people are actually very aware of the terms of service of these platforms, right? When you talk to them and when you interact with them, you realize that they know that Twitter cannot ban me for saying this, right? So the one that I think has always caught my eye is the weaponization of news reports, actual ones, right? That just happen to pop up, that they will just happen to recycle and use to pop up at a certain point, and use to resurface at a certain specific time. I'm also personally very, I wouldn't say this, but impressed by the memes that they use, because those memes have a very specific audience. There is a very, for everything these guys create, they know that there is a very specific part of their audience that is actually likely to go ahead and believe this kind of stuff, that actually believes this kind of things. And that will endure. So for me, it's not that, I'm not really keen even on the new stuff. I'm more keen on the stuff that has just refused to go away, right? Because that means that is what is working. And also, that means that's something that someone is willing to pay for time and time again,
I'm interested in how the money changes hands, and I've noticed that that has just refused to go away.
Thank you, thank you. That is very insightful. And another question that I would probably want to throw to our panelists today is, we know that the Kenyan election is coming up in August next year. So what would you advocate for between now and during the Kenyan election to highlight the influences of disinformation, and so that people are aware that this is going to happen, or like how to actually counter it at the end of the day? So I'll start with you, Jean.
So first, let me note that I think we've all had this coming from the government, that they say they are aware of the situation and that they will act on the actors. So if indeed they are going to act on the actors, then I mean, if that could happen, then that would be great, that people should see that there are consequences for these. I do believe in the cybersecurity laws, there is something, or the clauses that they use when they are prosecuting people, those can also be applied to the actors, and not just the people who are on the social media, but the ones who are, if evidence is found of the ones who are actually paying for this offline, those are also the people who do need to be prosecuted. At the platform level, on Twitter, I strongly believe there needs to be some more transparency as to how you're able to report these kinds of cases of misinformation. I'm pretty sure you have a lot to say on that, on what it has taken even to get those accounts down, but that needs to be more transparent. You should be able to report posts that, this is toxic and misleading content. That is, I think, those are the main ways that I can think about right now.
Yeah, Odanga, I know you have something to contribute. Yeah.
So what I would say here is Twitter needs to get rid of the trending section. Yeah, clean. They need to get rid of the trending section because it's not serving any, it's not really doing any good to the platform, right? And it's simply serving the purpose of poisoning the well, right? Without the trending section, the job for these disinformation actors becomes a bit harder, right? There are several people who are of the school of thought that this trending feature is not really helping platforms become healthier. YouTube had one. I think they had to quickly just start wrestling with it a lot more, right? They even had to start removing it from, the front of their interfaces. I think the feature is still there, but it's not as prominent as it used to be. Facebook had one and quickly shut down the feature, right? Because of the kind of misinformation that it was pushing out, right? But Twitter has stuck by it. And when we asked the executives at Twitter about, are you willing to get rid of this feature in the platform? They said that, no, we feel that we need to invest more in the platform and not get rid of it. So I asked them, okay, so until you decide to invest in it, are you just going to continue making money off of disinformation from it? They kept quiet. So, I think for me, there's that aspect of, specifically for Twitter, this is very feature driven. And so we won't get rid of disinformation tomorrow, but we can definitely make it a bit harder for these actors to be able to take advantage of these features on these platforms. So yeah, that's what I'd have to say about that.
So just a follow-up on that. So don't you have probably something positive that you can say about the trending system? Because I would presume there's someone out there who actually loves that section, because probably in a business perspective, they make money out of it. I don't know what your comment is on that.
I like to think about the current situation we have. You see, the thing is, platforms have taken down features before until they got a hold of the feature. We're not saying that the trending section is bad, but when Twitter had a problem with its what is it called? With its verification system, they put the thing on pause. They put it on pause severally, right? Until they got a hold of a way to make that feature work well for them and work well for its users, right? So that's what we're telling them. Stop using this thing until you can find a way to keep people from being manipulated by it. right? Because that's what you're doing. Make sense?
Yeah, interesting, interesting. And I know the elephant in the room is because you are speaking to investigative journalists and the media houses that are listening in at the moment. So I know the skill set that you have for you to do that kind of research and for you to arrive at the conclusions that you arrived at during the research. So what would you advise in terms of skill sets and investments that needs to be done on our newsrooms, in our newsrooms, so that they can actually identify such kind of disinformation campaigns? Probably I'll start with you, Jean.
Okay, so one, of course, is fact-checking. That needs to be part and parcel of everyday life. And as Odanga spoke about how one of those videos was now somehow integrated into mainstream media. No, that can't happen. Because people are taking your word as the truth. People are not going to fact-check the media. So if you yourselves are not fact-checking, then, you're not really helping the situation. So that needs to be one. And also actually equipping the journalists with some of these skills. And of course, organizations like Code for Africa, we are here for that kind of support to the individual newsrooms. And especially for Kenya, as we are getting into this election cycle, those are things that we really, really need to re-emphasize because of our history, because of what we have seen, because of what we are seeing even now, that we are doing this investigation 2 years before the election was even a thing. That in the middle of COVID, in the middle of all that was going on, here was this political campaign aiming at an election that is 2 years away. So for newsrooms, they are our frontliners really in this fight, that they need to be the ones to lead us on this.
So I agree completely with Gina. So I think I'd put some recommendations also in my slide, which is familiarize yourselves with analytics tools, right? So for me, it's actually very important because they help you understand how networks actually end up, or rather how the information flows through all of these networks. I think it's also very important to just read, right? So read again about, what the psychology of disinformation campaigns is like. Read about, the events that happen within platforms as well. And of course, again, one other thing is I would appreciate if more journalists made friends, right, with just the same way, like I think one of my friends who covers corruption told me that usually you just need to have friends who are auditors, right? Same thing with even this space that we are in right now. You want to talk to people who are, because this is a huge thing, you want to talk to people who are familiar with politics, people who are rather close to politicians, right? Really focus on developing your sources as well. Talk to cybersecurity pros as well. I think I personally, from Brian, has just literally, blown my mind with the kind of things that he's been able to uncover with his work. And also, I think maybe just learn that this work, as you cover this work, you also putting yourself in some form of danger, right? And so you need to learn how to protect yourself online, which I think actually is the biggest thing, because you don't want to be doxxed, right? So, or wake up in the morning to find your name trending on Twitter for some reason, right? So, and we've seen several journalists go through that kind of thing. So I think top of the list for me would be learn how to protect yourself online. If you're determined to investigate this thing, you'll find a way. But you also just need to be ready for the potential backlash that could come to you as well.
Thank you so much. So I don't know if we have questions from the audience. Yeah, I see we have one.
So I'm interested from both of your perspectives, actually, in terms of, this is just me, kind of my assessment based off of your presentation and some similar work that we've been doing. It feels like the campaign that you kind of identified last year, and it was clearly anti-Ruto, it feels like that was a dry run. And you mentioned that a lot of the systems and softwares that they're using are the same that the rest of us kind of would use to be able to identify whether a social media marketing campaign's working. So I'm wondering what you see as like the emergent either tactics or technologies that some of these people would use, because I would presume that if we do have a situation where they're testing things, they're bringing that information back to kind of whoever's sponsoring them, they're building a business case, they're basically saying here's like the opportunity gaps, etc. So what does that look like from both of your perspectives in terms of tactics and then technology? Because this is just a classic, I mean, you see this in law enforcement, you see this in security, like the people who are trying to prevent things are always one step behind, right? Very rarely do they get out in front of the issue. This kind of work is overwhelmingly reactionary, so I'm curious what you see moving forward.
Yes, so I don't know who wants to go first. I see. Probably just to set the context, on that particular aspect, what we are seeing as the current tactics, one of the things that when we realize that we have a couple of hashtags that are actually created or curated to mention the names of politicians. So ideally, I think our approach is number one, why don't we monitor any mentions of our politicians, right? We already know who are the probably running for positions within the coming elections as at now. So you monitor those mentions. And I think there's a clear thing that we've picked up. I think, Jean, maybe you can talk more about that. I know you've been looking at it.
Yeah, so the camps are more or less, it's very divided who is on which side of the debate. It is very clear those who are for Uhuru, those who are for Raila, and those who are for and against Ruto. And that is very clear in terms of even the narratives. The ones who are for Uhuru will be praising all the work. The ones who are for, against Ruto will be preaching all these narratives about why he's the problem and how he's the stumbling block in the administration. So now going forward, it will be now taking that and just amplifying it and maybe even trying to get smarter at the techniques they're using. But as Odanga has said, the techniques are persisting. It's like, they have seen this is what works here, let us stick with it, it's working for us. So they will just now stick to that and amplify it even more toxic, even more polarizing. Some of the things we see, some very, very gory images that we see, and this is in now our day-to-day. As we get closer to the election, of course, it's going to get worse, still on those two very clear sides of the political divide. And maybe also seeing if these campaigns will spread offline. Those could also be avenues for us to keep just in our radar. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so probably just to add on that is the hashtags that probably I was talking about, they are actually very strategic because you'll see that probably this month the target is on this person. The next month they jump to another person, a different person. So it's actually really defined. So from the monitoring we've been doing, that's something we've picked up. And I think that is really interesting because now it shows you a trend. And I'm even glad that Odanga highlighted about disinformation for hire, because what that implies is that there's actually a machinery behind it, right? The coordination that you're seeing within these hashtags, the kind of amplification that you're seeing day by day, and it kind of resonates with what you've seen in the past. Then there should be some amplification, and probably there's now the monetary incentive behind it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, Declan.
So not really, actually. I'm genuinely, I think this is an offline conversation, but I think where we need to, as let's just say we're all seeing ecosystem, right? I'm private sector, but very much working on these civic and democracy issues. If we're going what we're using. But I think it's also about that next leap because we're very much in it now. And we saw what happened in the United States, which I think is the best example of disinformation and how that can influence kind of offline behavior. The U.S. is a massive media ecosystem. And if it was allowed to be manipulated to that extent, Kenya is not that difficult. It's not as robust an ecosystem. It's much more impressionable. As I think, where some of your frustration with the Twitter trending thing, right? So I understand where you're coming from with that frustration. It's much easier to get something trending here than in the United States or in the UK. But it is possible. And so how do we then combat that? I feel like that's also where the conversation is. So if we don't have the answer, that's fine, but that's my point.
Yeah.
Another question?
All right. Thank you so much for this illuminating conversation. I must first a confession. Not that strong on Twitter back home when I'm doing my work, but of course I understand how important this particular platform is, and it's now more clear from what you've been discussing over the last 30 or so minutes. Two quick ones for Mr. Odanga, yes. It's interesting that you came up with this. I don't know whether I should credit you for the coinage of this concept of a criminal services industry. I guess you should take it. But I find it interesting, and I wanted to ask you a quick one. I don't know about Kenya, but back home in Uganda, we have young people who have sort of cut something out for themselves using this particular platform they are now called social media influencers. I don't know whether it's the same here. And they sort of do work for companies. They do work around brands and pushing certain brands. Now, I don't know from your research and analysis whether you have this distinction, yeah? Do you have the good guys separate from the bad guys who are keen on pushing the terrible disinformation? What have you discovered from your research and analysis? And then a quick one on the verified accounts being rented for disinformation. I don't know whether I'm asking a basic question, but what was the original idea by Twitter to verify certain accounts? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. So the first one is around whether there are good guys and whether there are bad guys. So one of the things about these campaigns is that you learn when you speak to people at Twitter is that, number one, identifying coordinated behavior is very hard, okay? We have our definitions of inauthentic coordinated behavior within our research, but the platforms have their own definition. And they're very well aware that they are companies that are based in the United States, right? That they're companies that are based in the United States that don't necessarily have the context to be able to enforce their terms of service here in Kenya, okay? And so they don't want to be seen as these Western overlords, right? They don't want to be seen as these Western overlords. And so they're very careful about the kind of actions that they perform within our ecosystem. Now, there are, I don't know, good guys and bad guys, it very much depends on context, okay? But what I do know is that these services are available to the highest bidder, right? They're available to whoever is willing to pay for them, whether you're bad or whether you're good. And they have been used for good, by the way. When people want to launch a book, when you want to launch an event or a drink, right, or a product, people will hire some of these things. When you're having an event, people will hire some of these services because they want to get
There are things to spread. People have used it to spread ideas and ideologies, right? But then on the other end, they are often used for propaganda services because propaganda is what people are willing to pay for, right? So most of the time you find that a lot of people use them for propaganda. And so good or bad depends on who is paying, actually. Good or bad depends on who is paying. That's really it.
I think the question I would ask is, for instance, in Uganda, they even have an association. I think we also have it.
Yes, I would not be surprised if the same people within our influencer associations are probably also dabbling a bit in propaganda work. Yeah. Because again, like political, first of all, you think about Kenyan society. Kenyans really want to be close to politicians. So I would not be surprised. I'm seeing questions coming in. I would not be surprised if a few of those people are also involved in politics. Yeah.
Which played really a very important, not important anyway, but a critical role during the disinformation campaign, yeah? So how do you deal with such a situation where the state itself is taking part in the disinformation campaign?
I think for me, the main thing is, so you have two options. Because I think the Ugandan case was very sad, in my view, because number one, Twitter had been very negligent, or rather, Twitter and Facebook have been incredibly negligent of their East African ecosystems for a while, and then people figure out how to game it, right, to spread hate speech and disinformation, and it just so happens that it's the government, and then by the time you decide to act, it's too late. And then the platforms get banned in the country, and then you play victim, right? And say, how can you ban us for enforcing our terms of service in the country? But in reality, it's actually the real truth is that all the years of neglect that you had allowed to happen within your country is actually what created that ecosystem. And you simply acted too late, and now here you are, you've basically let your users down, you've let your users within that country down, and now they can basically no longer use that platform, right? So it's a very vicious sort of chain.
Vicious cycle.
Vicious cycle, yeah. So you get what I mean, right?
Yeah. So I think in the interest of time, I think in just... probably just before you can respond to one question from the audience, and then respond to his question as you do your final remarks.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's one question from Joy. She's asking, in Africa, when do these disinformation campaigns thrive, or when are they at their peak? So you'll answer that together with his question and give your closing remarks. Verified accounts.
Okay, so the verified accounts is simply that, number one, a verified account is, like you've seen it on Facebook, you're on Facebook, right? So you know the blue check on verified. It's because, number one, there are too many fake accounts online, right? So the main primary purpose is to ensure that that famous person I like following is the real famous person that I like following. It actually started off because of famous people, right? But over time, it has morphed into this form of knighthood for the digital space, where now when you get a checked account, it essentially means that you're sort of important, or your views sort of matter, right? And it's available to a certain number of people. Those of you who are familiar with the current scandals that are plaguing Facebook know that they even have a separate system for people who are actually public figures, right? And so this is something, because of that nuance, that people have begun to think that, okay, this must be an important account. You know, that's now when they end up being abused. Make sense? Yeah.
I think Jean will tackle that question from Joy. When do we see disinformation in Africa actually picking up?
Okay, so if it was about the actual time within a specific country, if that's what the context of the question is, I would say this is when a specific country is at a very sensitive time in their cycle, maybe politically, or there's something catastrophic happening in that country. But if the question was about when you know the campaign has succeeded, I'd say it's when it crosses out of that original network of the amplifiers into, for example, what Odanga was talking about, when mainstream media starts picking it up and taking it as something legitimate. I think once that crossover happens, then the campaign has quote-unquote achieved, and if they were reporting back to their funders, then they will report that as their metric of success, that yeah, it was picked up by mainstream media. So that when that crossover happens, and again, this is why we are really, really strong on the role of the media in fighting this, in fact-checking, and you know, in picking up the skills that they need to be able to identify and stop these campaigns.
Thank you very much, Jean and Odanga. I know we have one burning question from the audience, but I think in the interest of time, I don't know, organizers, if you can take the question. Yeah.
This is just a reaction to Odanga, where he said Twitter should probably take out that arm of that trends. But it's like telling them to stop earning because that's like their selling point. So what exactly could we do to compel them to take such features down that cause more harm than good, in terms of probably any viable solutions that we journalists can use to enable or compel them to take down such destructive features?
Well, I think right now the best thing to do is to place as much pressure as possible on these platforms by simply showing them, number one, the harm that is being caused by the specific hashtags that maybe might be used for propaganda campaigns, and also showing them the cases in which some of these campaigns break the law, right? Some of these things actually both are very clear hate speech. Like when you compare them to what is there within our constitution, they're very clear borderline hate speech and incitement. So those two, and the thing is, you're not the first person. Like when we try to compel these platforms to do this, we're not the first people to do it. There's an entire campaign called Stop Hate for Profit, right? Because that essentially is the idea, that these platforms are making money off of hate, right? And they know it. But it's, like you've said, it's very hard to convince someone who's being paid not to understand your point of view. So it is a tough challenge, and I agree with you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. As you can see, the conversation has been very vibrant, so that means it's a real issue that should actually be highlighted in all the countries that we are looking at. So thank you very much, Odanga. Thank you, Jean, and back to studio.